My name is Omar Chandler, class Math 129, summer 2013. Instructor, Professor Askew. Lesson 1, Chapter 8, Variables and Equations. Today we will be learning about variables, expressions, and equations. How many of you know what a variable, expression, or equation is? Raise your hand. Great. Okay. So let's start with a quick word problem to refresh your memory. I will be taking this from Teacher Resource 1. Mike drove to Atlanta, Georgia from Detroit, Michigan. The distance is about 713 miles. He then drove to a city in North Carolina. How many miles did he drive in all? We are going to work through this together. Let's write a number sentence to explain the word problem by going over the expression. The distance Mike drove to Atlanta, Georgia from Detroit, Michigan was 713 miles. Mike then drove to Atlanta, Georgia to a city in North Carolina. The distance from Atlanta, Georgia to an unknown city in North Carolina would be the variable. So the equation translates to 713 plus d for the distance from Atlanta, Georgia to the city in North Carolina equals m for the total number of miles Mike drove. This is a basic expression written out in algebraic form. Does anyone have any questions regarding what we just covered before we moved on? Okay, now let's move on. I will be passing out student resource number 1. Expressions are one or a group of mathematical symbols representing a quantity. Expressions can contain numbers, symbols, and variables, and they can also contain at least one of the operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Expressions can be written out in sentence form, or they can be written out using numbers, symbols, and variables. Expressions do not contain equal signs or inequality signs. A variable is any symbol that represents a number in an expression or any equation. A variable represents the unknown number. Let's provide a few examples. Numbers can be used to represent a value when writing out any expression. Symbols, there is a bit of difference when using symbols. A plus sign allows you to add values together. A minus sign allows you to subtract values from one another. A multiplication sign allows you to multiply values by one another. A division sign allows you to divide values by one another. Variables represent the unknown value in your expression and can be written in many different forms. I have provided a few examples of numbers, symbols, and variables. Now let's work through some of these examples on the worksheet under writing out expressions. The first example reads, a number plus 5. I know that we do not have a number to add to 5, and when we do not have a number, we use a variable. So a number added to 5 should look like m plus 5. The next example reads 3 times a number. I know that we do not have a number to multiply by 3, and when we don't have a number, we use a variable. So 3 times a number can be written in 2 ways. It can be written as 3n or 3 times n. This is the last example where we work together. The remaining 2 you will work on independently and will discuss the answers you came up with together. The example reads 3 times a number plus 5. I know that we do not have a number to multiply by 3 or add to 5, and when we do not have a number, we use a variable. So 3 times a number plus 5 can be written in 2 different ways. It can be written as 3y plus, let's write it over, 3y plus 5, or in parentheses 3 times y plus 5. Is that clear for everyone? Now let's complete the last 2 problems on your own. Once students have completed the remaining example on their own, students will share their answers and explain why their answers make sense. Then we will move on to the next part of the lesson. We have covered the meaning of expressions and variables, as well as work through some of the examples. And there are there any questions before we move on? Okay, now we can move on to equations. First, let's go over the meaning of equations. Equations is a mathematical sentence that uses an equal sign to show that 2 quantities are equal. This is a major difference between expressions and equations. Expressions do not have an equal sign, while equations do. There are some other differences between expressions and equations, and we will discuss them before the end of the lesson. But first, let's work through a few equations together. I will be passing out student resource number 2. As an equation is a math sentence with an equal sign, it shows that 2 expressions are equal or have the same value. Let's work through the first 2 together, and you will complete the remaining problems on your own. The first problem reads, a number multiplied by 23 is 92. First, we have to consider the variable. Then we have a number divided by 23. Divided by 23. Then we have equals 92. Does everybody understand that? Are there any questions? Let's move to the next example. The next example reads, a number added to 98 equals 156 added to 21. Now this one is a little more complex because there is an equation on each side of the equal sign. Let's break things down and consider each part of both equations. First, we will consider the variable y. Next, we will add 98 to the unknown number. Plus 98. Now let's consider the next part of the equation. Equals 156 added to 21. Equals 156 plus 21. This equation can be solved by adding the numbers right of the equal sign together and solving from there. Now you will complete the remaining problems on your own and will be discussed when completed. Once students have completed the remaining problems on their own, we will share the answers and explain why they make sense. Then we will move on to the post-assessment quiz. We have discussed the meaning of equations and worked through writing out a few of their questions. Before we move on, let that conclude today's lesson. Now we can move on to the post-assessment quiz. Students, pass up your worksheets and clear your desks in preparation for your quiz. A post-assessment quiz, Student Resource 3, will be passed out to the students as a way to assess what they have learned during today's lesson. And that concludes today's lesson 1. Thanks a lot.